James Allison, really creative author, great stuff. Beth Johnson, well known for a lot of her writings. Peter Steinfeld's editor of the religion editor of the New York Times, and Ron Wolheim's a very popular spiritual writer. Anyway, it's great. Rick did a great job, and I appreciate that. In fact, he's here tonight. He's worried I'm going to steal his material for next week. Removing the baptismal priesthood. I remind as I walk in the room, I'm talking about the laity priesthood next week. So now I have to modify my phone. Anyway, I'm dedicating the lecture this evening to my supervisor of my dissertation at Oxford, John McQuarrie. We have I was hoping that his picture would encourage the technological world. We could use his picture and maybe something like that. Scott, could you work on that?
Yes.
Oh, really? Dedicated John McQuarrie. Anyway, he was a great Anglican theologian, a wonderful man. That's why I went to Oxford to do my dissertation. I studied under him at Union Theological in New York and became Lady Margaret Professor at Oxford. And that's why I went there to do my dissertation, because I knew he was a man who had great self-confidence and knew that would not be threatened by anything that I was going to write. Whenever people do a dissertation, I say the main thing is find somebody who's self-confident and not threatened, because you'll soon know more than they know about whatever you're doing. And then they got two choices, what you write, what you want to write, or what they want you to write. So that's the most important thing. So that's why I chose him, a very self-confident man, and knew what he was talking about. So, and he died recently, and he had me at his home for dinner, nice to meet him regularly. His wife Jenny was a local lady, and two children, and one was, I think, had form of Ansberger disease. When I was at their house one night, he came into dinner and he just walked around the table for, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes. John was just totally at ease with that, didn't say anything, walked around, finally sat down. So he was actually a genius in some areas. So anyway, he's a humane person, a wonderful man, great scholar, wrote wonderful stuff. I dedicate the lecture to him tonight. So I'm talking about renewing the ordained priesthood. The notes you have actually are out of date. They were done this morning. Obviously by now are no longer relevant to the talk. I've reshaped the talk. Since then, there's material in there that could help as you go along. Consider that the early version, and you get the later version of the talk. So, I'm going to, if I was going to retitle it, it would be Contextualized Solutions and Radical Solutions. And I want to take what I call contextualized solutions first. So, and I'm going to, as I often do, use composite stories to try to make my point. So, my first person I'm talking about, I'm naming Barnabas. Barnabas went to a priest and serving for a number of years, and went to the University of Dayton to take a course on theology of Karl Rahner. And when he got there, he was wasn't even too sure why he decided to come there. He wasn't terribly open to what was going on in the class, but he stuck with it. And after each class, he had to write a response paper. And you can see his responses were really drawing him into this material of Rahner. He came at it as self-described as a very authoritarian pastor, the old-style pastor. And he ran his parish with an iron hand, and what he said went. And in many ways, he was like a Lone Ranger kind of pastor. He wasn't terribly interested in collaborative ministry or all that kind of stuff. And his theology was largely pre-Vatican II theology. Christology. So he's sitting in his class trying to listen to lectures and read Ronner's Foundation for Christian Faith, and as time goes on, he becomes actually interested in the material. And he actually is beginning to let it make an impact on him in the class, and it's moving him to rethink his whole style of ordained ministry. And there's certain theological themes that catch him up. A lot of the Christology seemed important to him, the study of Christ. And there's a lot, the great emphasis, I think, for Barnabas and his priesthood and so on. Christ was always the divine figure, and he was privileged to be another Christ. Barnabas himself, another Christ, and carrying on the work of the divine Christ in the church. I think that's fundamentally how he saw himself. He thought the essence of what he was all about was that he could make Jesus present at the Eucharist, in the words of consecration. So he was a part of what we would call a cultic sense of what priesthood is all about. And he felt good about that, and that was a part of his joy and glory in the priesthood. And as he's going along and listening to Ronner's a whole bit about Christ, and Ronner had this idea that many Catholics, and maybe Barnabas and Peter, were in implicit heresy on the question of Jesus. So it was very easy, able to see that he's divine, but had a whole lot of trouble realizing that he was human. And so Ronner's great emphasis on the humanity of Jesus was very important and really represented a radical shift. So once he began to think, well, Jesus was, fully human, as the scriptures tell us, like us in all things but sin, that began to influence the way he thought of the priesthood. So he's thinking, now, let's talk about Jesus and how he acted and how he went about trying to form community. That became one of the touchstones in the class, that Jesus was a community builder and did it in so many different ways. He carried on the ministry of John the Baptist to restore Israel. He picked 12 inner circle disciples to represent the 12 tribes of Israel, that he's going to restore them. When he cures the lepers, he tells them, go show yourself to the priest, so that the priest could let them back into the community. People who were excluded and on the margins come back into the community. Jesus not only cured them that way, but helped them to reestablish their life with their families and going to synagogue and so on. So all those things, and then he began to love to meditate on the Last Supper in John's Gospel, where Jesus is portrayed as washing the disciples' feet. And he loved all the talk about Jesus as the good shepherd going after the stray. And so all of this begins to form in his mind a whole other understanding of how he might act as a priest. He might try to imitate Jesus and be a servant to the people in his parish. And then part of the Christology class also had to do with the risen Christ. The Christ, he had a great sense of the death of Jesus. The stations were important to him. It ended with the burial of Jesus and the death of Jesus. In his homilies, he often talked about that Jesus died for us on the cross and enables us to save our souls as a result. And in the class, he began to see another side of what we call the paschal mystery, that the death leads to resurrection. He loved Ronner's idea that Jesus emptied himself so completely and fully that he was able to be filled totally with the Spirit and that God could take him over, as though resurrection happens in self-emptying. It was a hard concept and he wrestled with it, but paschal mystery, death and resurrection. Resurrection isn't like God saying, boy, you did good there on the cross, what will I do for you? Well, I got it. After 3 days, I'll raise you to life. But it was like resurrection is what happens. That's what Ronner says in the foundation. Resurrection is what happens when there is total, complete self-emptying. So he began to see his ministry is carrying on the work of Christ. He began to think of himself as a representative of Christ to his people, and that he would be empowered by Christ, the risen Lord, to carry on that ministry. And he began to think about what he would need to do that. He was very worried throughout the class that how would he ever go back and make this stuff real for his people. He was worried that the people wouldn't know how to take him or accept him in some sort of new way of operating. And so he thought a lot about developing the virtues he would need to do this. And one of the virtues that he thought would be important to him that was dealt with in the anthropology of Karl Rahner, that is, how does he understand human nature and how do we grow and develop, and the great importance of developing virtues to become an effective minister of the gospel. He talked about dialectical virtues based on Rahner's anthropology. And so he began, one of those that his struggle was enlightened simplicity. And he knew he couldn't just go back to his people and give them all this Rahner stuff. You know, that wasn't really going to work, or the way he had to go about it. So he liked that idea of enlightened simplicity, that he now had sort of a new sense of who he was as a priest. He was to be a servant to the people. He was to wash feet like Jesus did. You know, he was to try to be inclusive, drawing the community together as the Master did. So to do that, he's thinking that I know this in my head, but I have to find simple ways of telling the people that. I have to be able to interact with them on a human level. They have to get to know me better as a person so that my message will come across. He was taken by a phrase that was used in classroom, J.C. Hockenheim, Protestant ecclesiologist, who said you should never preach to any community that you didn't serve. Because preaching gets its bite, its challenge, its strength from the service that's given within that community. So he was taken to that. But he had to find simple ways of doing that. He had to not come across as, oh, yeah, I just learned all this new theology I'm going to tell you about. But he was going to use it. It was more like the iceberg below the surface that would guide him. But he would find ways like Jesus to tell simple stories of how one would live out the gospel. So he was very taken with what we call narrative theology, storytelling as a way of getting the message across about what the kingdom is all about. So he needed that kind of virtue. He also felt the need to develop a virtue that was called in class a committed openness. Again, a dialectical virtue that seems sort of opposite, be committed but be open. And so that he recognized that he had to know where he stood, who he was, what his history was, and he wasn't proud of a lot of the ministry as a priest. He was not proud of how he was such an authoritarian and how he demanded everyone do it his way. Well, he had to deal with that as part, but his commitment came out of the fact that he represented a tradition that is so important. A true Catholic tradition that just fits in with what the culture needs. So when he got up in the pulpit, he would have something to say about people in their real life. Well, he'd be able to say, yes, we live in a culture that's too consumerist in its outlook, and we have this wonderful tradition of asceticism. We live in a culture that's so superficial, and our Catholic heritage talks to us about the great mystery that surrounds us and envelops us and loves us. And in terms of the individualism in the culture, the Catholic heritage gives important things to say about community life. Once again, that Jesus is the community builder, and now I'm the community builder as his representative of Christ in the world. And so he develops that confidence because not because he's great or anything, but because he represents a tradition that's so important, so powerful, and so right on for what the weaknesses are of U.S. culture today. And then that, he wanted to be open. He wanted to listen to his people. Thinks all the time I blew him off. People came in to see me. I never really paid much attention to him. And he wants to listen now. He wants to listen to people who are different. He wants to listen to the conservatives in his parish and the more progressive ones. He'd like to listen to the charismatics and the people who'd like to listen to the women who feel disenfranchised. He wants to be open to truth and goodness and beauty precisely because he represents that Catholic heritage. So this seems extremely important. So he's in the business of trying to develop virtues. Then he thinks about, well, what are the skills I need to do this? And he's very taken with one of the passages in the decree on life and ministry of priests from Vatican II. He was looking at the councils and what that was all about. And he was taken, in that document, number 9, it says something like this, that the pastor's job is to discover with faith and to foster with diligence the many gifts of the lay people in the church, the many charismatic gifts. So that struggle, I mean, he had his own way of saying what that was all about. It was to spot the talent and to encourage people to develop it, to help coordinate it, so it would be for the good of the parish, and to try to coordinate all those different gifts, so that he began to see himself as not the servant leader, because he knew there'd be a lot of other servant leaders in his parish, but the servant overseer, the servant who would hold the thing together, who would be able to spot the talent, bring it forward, keep the unity, give a vision to the parish, help the parish to grow and develop. So he's the overseer in all of that. He's the one who will bring it all together. So he begins to see that's one of the skills that he's going to need. And now, fearing to tread on Dr. Gallardi's things, they can't help it because sooner or later he has to deal with the fact that there's 30,000 lay ecclesial ministers in the church today, working at least 20 hours a week at a paid job in the parishes. You got to deal with 30,000 of those people, right? At least the ones that are in his own parish. So one of the skills he needs is to learn how to interact with those people. And a lot of those people know a good deal of theology. A lot of them are more advanced than he is in his theological understanding. He's had a 6-week course in contemporary theology. Some of these people have been taking courses for years at lay ministry programs, read all kind of books, and so on. He has to figure out how he can interact with all of those people. It's clearly one of the great skills that he's going to need. He's going to have to figure out, and this scares him, honestly, how to collaborate with those people and to collaborate with the volunteers in his parish who are maybe not so well prepared. And he picks up a tip from the professor of the class who says something like this: never get any of those people that want to work in your parish and so on to do something they're not competent in or interested in doing. He filed that away. Don't have people doing something they're not competent in, and don't have them doing things they're not interested in or excited about. That's a good way for him to come at this thing. So his kind of thing, he says, I can do this in a way, I can try to get, when I get back there and hope that people accept me, I can try to get a lot of people doing different things to multiply the energy centers and make it all work for the good of the parish. That's sort of a broad notion of collaboration that he can use. We get it all sort of working together. I get a vision and everybody, empower people, and we'll all sort of do and use our talents, and we'll make the parish more vital. So, but he also knows there's another type of collaborative ministry, more intense collaborative ministry. So he thinks, well, I'm not into that myself, but I could get people like to work on a retreat together. So I get 3 people to work on a retreat together. And then those people now, they'll come together and they'll try to discern the gifts and talents that they have. Like who's going to do what job here in getting this retreat ready. And they call in other people to talk to about how we're going to run this retreat. The people that are going to go on a retreat, they get ideas from them and so on. So then they begin together to develop a plan of how you're going to go about all of this. And they get feedback and so on. And they work together and they try to support one another. They pray together. So, and they are accountable to one another. They can't just go up and do their own thing. We're doing this retreat together, and you have to get that leaders ready for that small group discussion, and if you're not doing it, we call you to account. The other 2 of us say, no, that's your job. You have to do that. And then when we're doing it, we try to pray together, and we try to collaborate with others, and then when it's all over, we're open to criticism. So he recognizes that that is a mode of collaborative ministry. I'm calling it an intense mode as opposed to a broad mode. He's okay with the broad mode himself. Try to get people working together, simple way in the parish. But he's also recognized that some people are going to have to do it in other ways and try to get this more intense kind of collaboration. Well, Barnabas' great hope is that people accept him, and his great sadness is that he didn't come upon this other idea, what the priesthood would be all about sooner in his life. He now sees himself as the shepherd of the flock. He's not just somebody who's got this sort of power to make Christ present. He's the overseer of the community. He's the servant overseer. And he's got a lot of other servant leaders in his parish, and he's going to get them to work together. He's going to try to foster this collaborative thing, and he's going to try to spot talent. And when he spots it, he's going to be joyful about it. He's going to try to bring them forth. And all those people in his parish, the lay ecclesial ministers who know more theology than he does, and more psychology, and more about almost anything you can think of, he's not going to be threatened by them. He's going to try to listen to them and bring them forward and so on. Well, that's Barnabas. And that's my way of talking about a contextual solution. That's renewing the priesthood from within the context that we currently have. There's absolutely no reason why we can't do a better job of educating priests, why we can't encourage more continuing education among priests. There's no reason at all why we priests can't listen to the call of the Spirit to become more dedicated, committed people. No reason at all why we can't learn to collaborate and why we can't improve ourselves. Nobody's stopping us from doing any of those things. Reading the scriptures, making sure we meditate every day, learning from other people, trying to develop an authentic pastoral spirituality that's not just modeled on Thomas Merton, who lived in a hermitage, but is a spirituality that is and contends with the busyness of life. Oh, we can do that. Nobody's stopping us from doing any of that. And we could renew the priesthood in that contextual way. So maybe in the question period we can come back to Barnabas and what that's all about. And so on. Now, I have other side of this thing. And now we have Lydia. Lydia, you probably could locate her pretty quickly. anyway, Lydia is a very accomplished woman. She's has advanced degrees, and she works in the corporate world. And she's been very interested in her faith. And she's made it her business to study that faith. She took the lay ministry program. She's taken courses in theology at different places. She's learned a whole lot about the various areas of theology. She can give you a good summary of what's being said about Christ or about the church. She's her own field of expertise is liturgy. She's very interested in that. In fact, she's written some articles about liturgy and so on. So very, very knowledgeable theologically. And also, she's been very interested in her own spiritual growth. That's been a very big part of it for her. So she's done a number of retreats. She's learned 2 or 3 different meditation techniques. She does an Ignatian meditation technique sometimes. She's like centering prayer. She tries in various ways to calm herself, to be reflective. She reads spiritual books. She likes Ron Woolheiser, and she liked that other book by Thomas More. And she reads voraciously in the area of spirituality. And it's this prayer and meditation has made a difference in her life. She's very attuned to the Holy Spirit. She recognizes that she didn't get any of that in her training. The Holy Spirit was largely neglected. It was Jesus and the Father. And she has just felt so energized by thinking about this third person of the Blessed Trinity, the one we call the Holy Spirit, the one that came down on Pentecost. You know, the Spirit that led Peter to be open to bringing Cornelius into the church. The Spirit that was at work in the Council of Jerusalem in the year 49 that said we won't put extra burdens on the Gentiles, we'll allow them to come in. Very taken with the New Testament and the way the Spirit was at work. Even the way the Spirit guided Jesus. The Spirit drove Jesus out into the desert to be tempted. As Jesus interacted with him, it was the Spirit that came out of him. So that she begins to see her spiritual life as guided by that Holy Spirit. And as she's doing her prayer and reflection, she becomes convinced that God is calling her to the priesthood. She hears the Lord in her heart. And she thinks about it. And she asks herself, does that make sense? So one of the things she does, she thinks about the situation in the church. And she thinks about the fact we don't have enough priests. Wow. Have more, pretty simply here. So we don't have enough priests, she's saying. We could do something about that by allowing women to be ordained. And she thinks through her own talents and gifts, and she thinks about, would I be good at that? Could I get up and give a good homily? Could I preside at the Eucharist? Could I coordinate, develop the talents of people around? Would I be threatened by people who knew more than I do? Would I be a good community builder? And as she's thinking about that, she thinks, I could do a lot better than most of the guys I see doing. She could easily become hypercritical. And she recognizes that about herself. She could easily be hypercritical. She's often unhappy with the homilies, often unhappy with the authoritarianism in the church. And it's hard for her to go to functions at the cathedral. Where she walks in there and sees all of these priests, these males, around the altar. She wasn't too thrilled with Germ and the changes that were made because she saw that as sort of a growing clericalism in the church. So she's thinking to herself, oh, I could do this job. I feel called. Right? But she recognizes that that's just her personal bit, that has to be tested. And so she begins to talk to her friends about that. One of her friends feels called the same way. And one of her friends has decided that she is going to leave the Catholic Church and become an Anglican. She's married, has 2 children, and she's going to go to the Episcopalian seminary to prepare to be an Episcopalian priest. So that's one of her friends. That's her path. And Lydia thinks, that isn't me. I can't see leaving this Catholic Church. I can't see going in another direction like that. It's in my bones and blood. I don't think I would be satisfied someplace else. So she listens to her friends, male and female, about this call, and some are sort of skeptical of it, and others affirm her greatly, and almost everyone says, yeah, you'd be good at it. You would be good at it. You'd be a good servant overseer. You'd be very good at that. And so she gets a lot of affirmation in there. But she thinks, this is not just me again and my friends. I'm part of an institution. I'm part of an ordered community that has a structure. And so she decides that she's going to make an appointment with her pastor to come in and talk to him about it. And she works mightily to prepare for this meeting with her pastor. She comes in with notes. She comes in with all books. And she's done her homework. And she's read a lot of history about the ministry in the church. And she's become convinced that you can't discuss this thing without starting with the fact that this ordered community is what carried on the Jesus movement. And that in that community, from the very beginning, there was a fundamental equality. The Jesus movement, was immediately structured. There was 12 who were the inner circle. In the 12, there was one who seemed to be foremost and be the first among all of those other apostles. So she's done her homework on the New Testament and sees that vision, this ordered, structured community, had the task of carrying on the mission of Christ, of keeping alive the memory of Jesus. And that throughout the biblical period in the early centuries that got developed. It's under the power, she thinks, of the Spirit that they figured out how they were going to order that community and what roles people were going to play. Well, that becomes her sort of dominant framework for thinking about this ministry thing and whether she can be called to ordained ministry or not. She read a book by Edward Ccls, the Dominican theologian, who said that the history of ordained ministry is a history of clericalization. So his reading of the history is that at the time of Constantine, the ordained clergy began to take on the trappings of the imperial world. That over a period of time, the ordained took on all of these other jobs and functions that in Corinth, for example, as we read in the letters of Paul to Corinthians, that various people had these various gifts and charisms, and that over a period of time that became sort of taken over by the ordained priest, who becomes aware of all of this. So she sees this clericalization, and she thinks about, well, what looked good to me in the church? She's convinced that in the early church, the women played an important role. She actually thinks that there were deaconesses in the early church that were functioning that way. And that there were more leadership things. She's of the opinion that the leadership of women in the early church has been erased. And that there's traces of it, and you have to find those traces. So she believes the early church was much more open. She knows that in Carthage, in around 250, when Cyprian was the bishop, that's one of her favorite periods. Because at that time, when you had a different faith community, there was a new overseer appointed, an episcopus, that we would call a bishop today, but I'm not sure that exactly fits. It fits more like pastor. And that they couldn't be appointed there without the consent of the community. The community either chose them or approved them. And this kind of history really takes her. She says how consultative Cyprian was in dealing with the great questions of the time, and how they counted on the Spirit to guide them to make the decisions in that local church, and how they tried to develop the charisms of different people. She loves 250 in Carthage under Cyprian. And I think the fact that he was martyred in 258 after 9 years of being the bishop there, the head bishop, sort of gave her a sense that, yeah, here was a man of substance, and that this really counted. One of her, as she looks through the history of her least favorite periods, is the first half of the 20th century in the United States. She sees there a period of almost total clerical domination, where the pastor did everything. Where the pastor ran the parish, presided at the Eucharist, took communions of the sick, visited the sick, conducted the devotions, very often the Marian devotions, administered the parish, took care of the finances. There's some people in the room here who actually remember that. That's one of her least favorite periods in the whole history of the church. And it speaks to her of the culmination of this clericalization process that went on. And where it was the saying seemed to be true that pay, pray, and obey was a great law for the laity. And that what Pope Pius X said was really, said all, that the main job of the laity was to obey the hierarchy. So Lydia isn't thrilled with that period. She likes the 19th century Catholic Church a lot better. Because she's a great component of getting back to lay trusteeism, where the lay people ran the parishes. In the 19th century United States, it was very different. The typical thing, the ethnics came to the United States, and the Germans gathered here in Cincinnati, and they bought land, and they built a church, and then they went down and found a priest, hired him, brought him in to run the parish. And they exercised great control, almost total financial control. In fact, they had more control over who came there than the bishop did. It was quite a remarkable period in the history of the United States, around the 19th century, and how strong the laity were. In fact, you get horror stories about how the priests were treated, and some group of women in Philadelphia were upset with the assistant pastor and chased him into this house where he lived, and he had to barricade himself in the attic. So they were after him. And so that there was all this, a lot of people felt that went overboard. And one of the groups that felt that was out of bounds were the bishops. They thought it'd be better if they appointed the priests, and if they were in charge of the finances. And so we ended up getting rid of lay trusteeism, and we see it in a different way. So Lydia is armed with all of this when she comes in to see the pastor. History. When she comes in to see the pastor, she also comes in with a sort of theological outlook, a theological perspective. And it boils down for her to something like this. The action is in the parish. I could get a job in the diocesan office with my training and background. I could be an official somewhere in a diocesan structure. She knows that. But for her, that's not where the action is. The action is in the parish. She loves, in her own theologically, I mean, she dabbles in Ronner and he's okay. But her favorite theologians are Rosemary Ruther, Sexism and God Talk. She likes Ann Carr, Transforming Grace. She likes Beth Johnson, who will be here. She, who is. Likes the work of Elizabeth Fiorenzo. Those are real authors. Those are the ones that energize her that she likes. But she reads some Ronner and likes it. And one of the things she likes is Ronner's great emphasis on the parish as the primary actualization of the church. But it's in the church that people, in the parish, that people experience what church is. It's in the parish, in the local liturgy, and the social action and so on, that you encounter Jesus. That's where we keep the memory alive. That's where parents hand on the faith to the next generation. That's where we get encouragement and strength to try to spread the kingdom. She doesn't want to work in the diocesan office. She wants hands-on ministry where she thinks the real action is, in the parish. Parish is the great manifestation of what the church is all about. She feels called to this kind of ministry. So she comes in with this theology as well. And it's a theology of the Spirit. She's big on the fact that we all have gifts, that there's a fundamental equality in the church, that Jesus said, don't call anyone Father, that Jesus said the real community that counts are not my blood relatives, but the people who are my genuine disciples. She loves the whole idea of the disciple, the equality of the original disciples, that we should carry that on. So it's a pneumatology, theology of the Spirit. She loves what Pope John Paul II said to all of us: we should breathe out of two lungs. That means breathe out of the Eastern lung, like we try to do with our icon back there, in the Russian tradition of iconography. It's our attempt to breathe out of two lungs. That's what the Pope said. We just breathe out of the Western lung. The Western lung, we're big on Christology, Christ, the Father. The Eastern Christians been big on the Holy Spirit, the Transfiguration, all the manifestations of the Spirit. So she is very big on trying to breathe out of two lungs, as the Pope said. So she's trying to move in that direction. So she comes in to talk to the pastor about all of this. Puts this before the pastor. And her report of the conversation was something like, the pastor was very sad. The pastor was very sad that he couldn't respond more fully to me. That there wasn't anything practical he could do for her. He didn't have anything that will ordain you here in our parish next week. Or you can preside at the Eucharist tomorrow. I mean, he was sad. And when he heard that her friend, who he also happened to know, was going to the Episcopal Church and was going to be ordained in that church, he felt even sadder about the situation. So they began to talk about, well, what do you do besides be sad? What are you going to do in all of this? So she pointed out some of the things that she was trying to do. She's a member of Call to Action. She's a member of Future Church, run by Chris Shank out of Cleveland. And she likes their publication. She likes the fact that there's others around who want to push for women's ordination. When Future Church circulated a petition back in 2005 in preparation for the Synod of Bishops on the Eucharist, she was right in there on that. And she was very taken with the fact that the bishops had prepared a 50-page document on any problems connected with the Eucharist and failed in any one, and there was 20 questions they asked that they should think about, and never once was mentioned in there the shortage of priests. Not one word in 50 pages about the shortage of priests. Now we stop and think about all of that, and Lydia had a lot to say about that too, recognizing the great shortage of priests around that. Something like 80% of the Sunday celebrations in Brazil are led by lay people and not by ordained priests. The ratio of priests to parishioners around the world is a lot worse than it is here in the United States. And when Cardinal George suggested that maybe we would get priests from other countries to come to the Chicago diocese and serve for 5 years and go back, she was incensed. She was angry because she saw it as a fundamental violation of justice to take priests away from places where they had fewer priests than we are. So that was not a good solution to her. And the shortage problem, this bothered her. So she signed a petition to be sent to the bishops in preparation for the 2005 Synod on the Eucharist that said, that called for the ordination of married men and the lifting of the celibacy rule, and the bringing back into the priesthood priests who had left and got married, and for the ordination of women as deacons in preparation for maybe a further step somewhere along the line. So that petition circulated by Future Church, she signed, and she said, well, that felt like she was empowered to some degree. She wasn't alone. She was working with others who might try to do some way to get an open discussion of all of this. So that's part of her own goal now in life. That's what she goes around trying to do or talk about. I want an open discussion of the role of women in the church. Open discussion, so that we can see the various ways that we gradually move towards more important posts and so on. She's taken with the idea that women are sort of dissatisfied with what is going on in the church, and that that's causing other problems. So even to the point of the secularization of Europe, that when women are not happy with the church, they don't do a good job of handing on the faith to their next generation. And she's taken with the theory that that's part of the fact that we don't have more vocations of priests in the United States. That the mothers don't encourage their sons to do something that their daughters wouldn't be able to do. So she believes that is at work in all of this. Now, she's also, trying to find radical solutions. She very much likes a new book out, Like His Brothers and Sisters, by Fritz Wobinger, who happens to be a bishop in South Africa. And she likes it that a bishop has enough guts to speak up on this question. She knows that the Brazilian bishops made some effort along that line, but she likes it that this guy has wrote a book, and his solution, his radical solution to the problem is that you find within every local community, faith community, Bible Christian community, you find a couple, 2 or 3 leaders, genuine leaders, and that you then educate these people, and they become the ones who preside at the Eucharist in the community. They're ordained by the bishop, then they preside at the Eucharist. And then for Bishop Lovinger, there is an idea that there would be a coordinator bishop, they call him, priest, an animator bishop, who would help coordinate those people's lives. Now, those people would keep their regular jobs, and they would keep their family life and so on, but they would be ordained in order to serve the community, to make sure that the Eucharist would be available for the people, and to carry on the other leadership things that need to be done in terms of social justice and religious education and helping to build up the body of Christ and spread the kingdom. So she likes that book, like his Brothers and Sisters, by Bishop Lovinger, as someone who's willing to look for a radical solution. But she finds great comfort in 2 things that Karl Rahner said. Back in the early 70s, Karl Rahner wrote a book, and actually it was background material for the Synod of German Bishops, and it's published as The Shape of the Church to Come, in which he said, this is not an insolvable problem, this ordained ministry and shortage. He said what every community should do, every Christian community, and it's like Lovinger's in a way, only more extensive, is they should surface the real leader, the real spiritual leader of the community. And that person should be trained and given the proper education, and then the bishop should come and lay hands on that person and ordain them as the overseer of the community. And this would be the person who would preside at the Eucharist and preach the homilies and so on. So, and as Rahner says in The Shape of the Church to Come, it really doesn't essentially matter whether that person chosen is married or unmarried, or male or female. Just as we read in Galatians 3:28, in Christ there's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, male or female. So that's what Rahner proposed to the German bishops in 1972, and that's our friend Lydia is very taken with that. And she also likes very much another thing that Rahner wrote, in which he argued extensively and in difficult ways, I suppose, to follow, and Lydia spent a lot of time wrestling with the article, that there was no real biblical or theological reason why women could not be ordained priests. And the standard argument that Jesus didn't choose women to be apostles does not hold because of the social constraints. In other words, the 12 were the official witnesses to Jesus. They had to have been there from the baptism and all throughout his ministry up till his death and resurrection. They were the official witnesses. And in that culture at that time, it was impossible for women to be official witnesses. Therefore, the standard argument of why women couldn't be ordained would be undercut. And Rahner says that, therefore, the burden of proof against women's ordination would be on the magisterium that wants to exclude it. And that in principle, we would say, unless there's good reason not to, that freedom should prevail. Well, Lydia latches on to this. She loves this particular argument because it bolsters her position that she could carry out this ministry in the church. So, what are we dealing here with Lydia? We have someone who feels called to the priesthood. who's making an effort to educate herself, to develop spiritually, and to bounce off of the community her sense that she's called that way. She sort of recognizes that the community is vocational. There's a vocational sense of church. But the whole church is called by Christ to witness to Him, His truth, and to spread the kingdom in the world. And then within that larger called community, that there are individual callings to somehow share in the mission. And that some are called to be teachers, and some are called to do the work of social justice. And that, in her mind, some are called to be the overseers of the community. So, in this lecture, dedicated to a very creative theologian, John Quarry, we've looked at two kinds of ways of thinking about renewing the priesthood. One in the context of what's possible today, the kind of thing that our friend Barnabas is trying to do. And then we have the more radical thinking of people like Bishop Lovinger and our friend Lydia, who I hope will stay true to her Catholic heritage, follow her heart, and stay with the community and continue to try to develop herself and respond to the Holy Spirit and do whatever she can to try to renew the priesthood. Thank you. Let's see if we can figure this out ahead of time. So that someone over here will get the mic. Here we go. And then we can alternate. Try to agree with someone else. Yes.
Why were you disappointed when Lydia's friend decided to join the Episcopal Church?
Yeah. That was that other pastor who was... I mean, that becomes very personal, but the scene is very vivid in my mind. I did have that kind of... These stories are always composites of bits and pieces. Yeah, married woman, very close to her. She's wonderful. She went to school out east, and she even had me come out there and talk to the big group that she assembled. I was sorry that she couldn't live out her call within the Catholic community. She's a wonderful asset, a wonderful resource. And it's, you can put it, it's traumatic because the parents are not happy about that. And it causes friction. And within the family. So that's sort of, and there were many tears involved in this session. And I, of course, wished her well, and we prayed together. But that was just my genuine reaction. If you asked me right afterwards, how do you feel? I said, I'm sad that she couldn't live that out within the Catholic community. And of course, I mean, there's a history to that kind of thing. I mean, things never happen in isolation. Because I know it wasn't just her, I know all kind of women who have left the church for that reason. Not because they want to, maybe they want to become priests, but because they are in sympathy with those who do. So, anyway, yeah, I was a real life part of the composite in that. It was sad because couldn't live out what she perceived to be a vocation. Well, now, it doesn't mean that, one can be sure she has that call, or, that whole vocational ecclesiology I was talking about is very important. But it's not just an individual thinking, yeah, I want to be a priest, therefore go for it. Or even that we got women priests that would somehow make everything better. I don't think that that's the case. But there's, one would have to look seriously at those many women who feel that call and see if a real ecclesial discernment would help them. Can we get a microphone here? Right. We try to do these mics. So put your hand up over there and Pat will get you.
I really don't think the solution in our churches is ordained. Our youth are being raised today. They don't even know what the Mass is all about. They don't know the beauty of the Mass. They don't know the beauty of the Eucharist. You don't have to go to many churches to see kids, not only that, the adults. And I think we maybe should take a look at some of the non-Catholic churches. Cedar Creek is filling their church with our young people that are leaving, and so are a lot of the other non-Catholic churches. If we would teach kids the beauty of the Mass and what we have is something so special, people think of the Eucharist as a symbol. They're not thinking of it as receiving the body and blood of Christ. If we would imprint this back in our kids, we would fill our churches just like Cedar Creek. But our youth are leaving to go to Cedar Creek and churches like that because they're giving their youth what we're not.
What they're giving them is probably not exactly what maybe we want to. I mean, what they seem to be good at is community building.
Well, we're filling our churches.
Yeah.
And our kids are leaving.
There's
We need to take a look at this.
not just kids, but adults too.
Yeah.
I think they said that half the people at Cedar Creek are Catholics. So, I mean, there's no doubt that there's important things to be learned there. I think that the cause of lack of vocations, however, is broader than that. I think if we did exactly what you said, developed a better Eucharistic spirituality, I'm not sure it would solve the vocations question. And time could be, it might help, yeah, no doubt it would help. But what it would solve or not, I think is another question, because I think there's a lot of dynamics that are at work in that. One is cultural. That is that there's a whole other ethic besides service that's at work in our culture, linked with vocationalism, careerism in college, or the idea is you go to college to get a degree, so you get a really good job and have a nice house. So, I mean, that cultural context is clearly part of what's happening as well. So we're fighting that in a way. The church is countercultural. And we live in this society and not someplace else where all this material goods is available. Where you don't have that maybe in certain dioceses in Nigeria, where you have a whole lot of vocations and it's economically advantageous to go to the seminary, where there's other kind of motivations that would work. So that's one thing. I think too, that once you have, and really get on me now for invading this territory, but once we see the expanded role of laity in the church, and the possibility of lay people doing so many good things in the church, that is going to cut into the number of people who say they want to be celibate, ordained people. There was how many young men have I dealt with over the years who, have a sense of service, and if they could be married and be a priest, that's exactly what they would want to do. But they think, yeah, I could go to Notre Dame and get a master's degree in religious education, and I could run a religious education program in the parish and be a real servant leader and still get married. So that's a second thing I would raise up, apart from, I think your very good point about the Eucharistic spirituality. There's other reasons, and that would have to be taken into account when we look at the shortage. And I could multiply that, but that's at least two things. Jerry, wait a second.
Yeah.
This is my longtime friend, Jerry Carter. We played ball together, shortstop, second base. What a combination. Yeah. Yes, I did. What a combination.
I did want to ask, Father, you developed two different views of the priesthood, Lydia's and Bernard's, was it? Barnabas. Okay, Barnabas. But this, I think, necessarily limits the movement of the Spirit, one, and two, maybe opening up other possibilities toward building community and raising up leadership. And I think of the Renew program, the Christian Family Movement, and then we have the base communities in South America. We have efforts going on in this diocese right now to develop small faith communities within the diocese. And it seems to me that this is another kind of paradigm that could be used to develop more sense of a larger community as we come together for the liturgy, and maybe indeed begin to develop more leadership within the laity, feeling that they do have a responsibility as well as an opportunity to contribute to the churches in their particular areas. Would you be willing to respond to that kind of question?
Yeah, thanks, Sydney, for the comment. I mean, you're absolutely right about the small groups. One of the things we're trying to do is develop human groups in every residence hall. And there's all kind of good things that are happening there. And there's all kind of good things happening in Latin America with the base communities. But what is happening as well, I mean, the issue is, how do you maintain an ordered community that is Eucharistic based? So what, we've lost like 20% of Pentecostals, you're talking about Cedar Creek, in Latin America and Brazil. They've lost like 20% of Pentecostals in the last couple of decades. And many people blame that on the fact that the distinctive thing we have, that Cedar Creek doesn't have, or Pentecostal is the Eucharist. That is at the center of the Catholic imagination. And what happens when you're developing base communities and things like that is that without having the idea that you have ordained people to develop and celebrate the Eucharist, you're missing an important part of a potential solution. You know, the Dutch Dominicans have just come out with a suggestion that they let lay people run the Eucharistic celebrations, preside at the Eucharistic celebrations. I mean, there's serious people who are now proposing this. And you can tell what their real desire is to save the Eucharistic sense of the Catholic community. I was told by missionaries in Latin America that after a period of time of the base communities, and the people no longer miss the Eucharist. Have their meetings, discuss the scriptures, do their social action, and so on. It's like it's out of memory. And to me, you know, at the center of the Catholic imagination is the Eucharist, the real presence of Christ. That's back here, the Emmaus story. Jesus is recognizing the breaking of the bread. That's a Catholic story. That's Luke 24. That's part of what has made us what we are. Almost everybody here who's Catholic remembers First Communion, or getting married at Mass, or being confirmed, or having children baptized at Mass, or burying loved ones at Mass, or graduation Masses, or home Masses. It's central to us. And that is what is being lost in Latin America. And the more that happens in the United States, my guess is that we would start to suffer the same fate. Thanks for the springboard, Sydney. Jerry, are you next? Maybe they won't give you a microphone. They're afraid of what you're going to say. Go for it.
I'm confident, and I often think I was was born too late, and I think I'm going to die just about right on time. So. How much, and most of what I've always seen, and it's actually gone in the Catholic Church, in part, as there's a practicalness behind most of what has developed in the church. For example, I can think of, if I had come from the Protestant church, I can tell you that Mary ministry is not a panacea. It brings along its own potential problems. But is a Catholic Church, or is a Catholic Church looking seriously at the economics of it, and is that how much of the resistance is economics?
Under part of the hierarchy to expanding the pool.
Expanding into particularly married priests.
Well, historically, we know economics played a great role in mandatory celibacy. I mean, it's one reason that we got mandatory celibacy to begin with, because they couldn't figure out how to pass on the property in the churches. So economics has clearly historically played a role. I mean, I think the general perception is that the Vatican is not dealing with the question. I mean, it's not, you said the church is practical. I mean, it would almost seem as though there is some other doctrinal or spiritual thing at work. I mean, if you were going to be practical, you got Brazil, the largest Catholic population in the whole world, and in the Vatican, they know the percentage that we're losing every year to the Pentecostals and all throughout Latin America. They know that. And to say that, well, we're not going to take some practical solution to it, I don't think they're looking out of pragmatic concerns. There's some other concern that's at work. I mean, everybody in the Vatican knows that mandatory celibacy was a man-made law, that it's not mandated by the Bible, and that the early popes, when Peter was married and others were married, and you had married clergy all the way through the whole 2,000-year history. We had a married clergy. I mean, there's nobody in the Vatican that thinks you can't do that doctrinally. You know? So you're getting asked, why is that? Rick Lardy has the answer to this. We're very fortunate that we have.
But I do want to comment on the economic question, because I think it presupposes that we would continue to have the same structure for the clergy. We would just expand the pool who could be in it. And you mentioned Bishop Lobinger, and it's important to point out that throughout much of the world, there's some suspicion about the American penchant for professionalizing ministry. We operate on the assumption that a cleric, but also lay ecclesial ministers, are professional full-time ministry with graduate education and so on and so forth. In many parts of the world, the perception is that ministry doesn't necessarily require that. And Bishop Lobinger's model, for example, does not assume that you train somebody for 7 years of college and they give their whole life. You are calling them to a very limited and circumscribed ministry within a small Christian community, not unlike what Sydney was talking about. And they're trained to work collegially in that small context, and they're given the formation necessary to provide a basic pastoral leadership and sacramental ministry, while they would have an animator priest who looks more like our current model of the priest supporting them. So economically it changes, because you're not imagining that this is a full-time person who you have to pay and support their family and so on. The assumption is they would continue in their work in some other way, and they would work something like what we once imagined the permanent diaconate was going to be. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's very good. Thank you for that. And as Bishop Logan says, those people would keep their jobs, so they would support themselves in doing that. But I don't know about economics doing. I just can't think that that's what hides the Vatican of this, or anybody else who's resisting ordaining married people.
The going back to your earlier example of the Barnabas situation, we in the diocese here have had a lay ministry program for over 20 years, and we've had, deacons, as many deacons now as priests practically. And they're saying that they could have their education and so forth for change, for renewing, their priesthood. Well, we have every year part of the appeal that the money goes to educating priests, doesn't it? Isn't there? How are they being educated? Isn't this part of what you're talking about? Renewing the priesthood? What part is going on renewal? What are we talking about renewing the priesthood?
Tom, that's a very good point. I mean, where we train people to be priests in seminaries, to start with. And I didn't refer to it, but there's a very interesting book by Dean Hoagie, and studied the priests ordained in the early 80s compared to the priests ordained in the late 90s. And I did a chapter in the book, and my chapter was on who influenced them. And the great influence on priests ordained in the early 80s, there were three people very close together, Carl Rahner, Thomas Merton, and Henry Nouwen, as the major influences on those people ordained in the early 80s. When you go to the late 90s, it's not close. There's only one person who influenced them, and that's John Paul II. And in their seminary training, their report of their seminary training is so much more positive than the early 80s. The early 80s would say, well, I got a lot to learn, I have to continue to study, I have to figure out how to apply all this, and so on. I needed better stuff, and so on. Whereas those ordained in the late 90s, and with John Paul II being not only the unifying force of the church, but the major theologian for the whole church on every issue, those who come out of that are very confident of what they learned and don't feel as much need for continuing education, and are very clear that they now know how to minister and what to do. The only place they're not sure what to do is how to handle the money. But anyway, so my point is that you're getting very different kind of training in seminaries. And that is a question that one would have to look at and see, are there better ways of doing that? I mean, to come out of a seminary and to come into a parish with sort of one theology in one's mind, it's like the only theology is a recipe for disaster. To come into ordinary parish where there's pluralism, and where there's different ecclesiologies and different outlooks and different approaches, to come in, that is really putting someone in a tough situation. Seminary training has not been good for the life. I mean, I always said, when I went to seminary, if they were looking for a way to train you poorly, they found it. It's not like there was some golden era there in the past that was so terrific and came out. I mean, it was miserable. It was stultifying. It was not intellectually stimulating in any way. Now, there's probably some people who went there who were bright enough to figure out how to get something out of it and apply it. But it was bad stuff. And so it's not like there was this great era if we could just get back to it. You know, I learned to be a priest from the lay people in St. Mary's in Sandusky, Ohio. Anything I learned about a priesthood wasn't in the seminary. It was upon those people. They were my teachers in the way of being a priest. I'm forever grateful to them. And it was like they took me out of the way. I had any idea what I was doing or trying to do. And those people were good and kind and generous and helpful and understanding of weaknesses and failures. and helped educate me on what it meant to be a priest. That's where it occurred. So, I mean, I don't know how much what you make of that, but I mean, I don't think you can count on seminaries today to educate the next generation of priests in the way that maybe average parishes would be happy about, where they could come in and be collaborative, if that's what you want to do. I mean, if you come in and not want to be collaborative, then you have to deal with some people there who want you to be collaborative. So, I mean, there's a real tension that's created. So, I don't, anyway. The bishops are the shepherds, yes. It is a hierarchical community that we have. It was from the very beginning. And pastors have to be apostolic. I mean, the bishop's job is to hold it together. So, but, I mean, you have to, that would be an interesting study to see what kind of seminaries do they want. Or where do they send their potential priests to study? I mean, that would be, you could look at a profile of that and probably learn a lot about what they want. I mean, it's, you know, it's not a great secret. There's different styles in different seminaries, and different approaches and different theologies that are operative. But I mean, you're right, Tom. I mean, if you get back to that, I guess a lot of my hope gets back to the wonderful lay people we have. When I was in Sandusky, Ohio, the best thing that it was, I went to hundreds and hundreds of CFM, Christian Family Movement meetings. And the great thing about it was I couldn't talk. You had to sit there. I had hundreds and hundreds of meetings. I sat there and I couldn't say a word. And that was a great learning experience. You know, if you actually sit there and you know you're not looking to say something brilliant, or you've bought everything that's said, it's a whole different experience. You listen in a different way. You can actually listen to what people say, and you can learn from it. So, I mean, is there, you know, what is the hope in all this? Well, Barnabas got himself together. You know, Barnabas was a pretty tough nut to start with. And Barnabas found the Ranierian theology to be liberating. Looked the weight off of his shoulders. He felt like a new man. It was recreated. He couldn't get ready to get back to his parish. So there's ways in which some good things can happen. And I think we have to count on that. And I count a lot on the laity. And fortunately, we get to hear more about that next week from Dr. Richard Gallardi, who I hope all of you will come back to hear. Thank you.